How children listen, how we all listen. There's a lot to unpack, so buckle up. Here we go. Simply having a young audience in a concert hall is no guarantee they will actually be listening. They will undoubtedly be hearing the sounds around them, but not necessarily listening to or experiencing the music in a meaningful way. So how do children listen? And how can we get these young listeners closer to the music? So let's take a little bit of time just to talk about listening and what listening is. William Ford Thompson describes listening as the discovery of music in sound. Music researcher David Elliott at the University of New York describes 3 stages of listening that span the spectrum from passive to active: hearing, listening to, and listening for. E.M. Peterson likened listening to taking a journey with the listener as the traveler and the composer as the guide. They both follow the same path, and the composer leads the way, but the listener is free to observe the details that interest him the most and to look ahead or behind at any time. Kenarskaya and Winner, in their work from 1997, describe the listener as developing either an analytical ear or an expressive ear for music. Now, analytical listening and expressive listening is something well accustomed to in gatherings like this with people who have musical training and who have done a great deal of listening. But it's interesting if we think from the beginning of our lives, we listen instinctively with our emotions. We have a basic need to search out and be moved by the aesthetic experience. Even trained musicians must be prompted to listen analytically. Their primary entrance into listening is largely expressive. Tadle and Cudietta's work suggests that the traditional musical element approach common to many music curricula is counter to the way the mind intuitively engages music. According to Cudietta, a sounder approach would be non-elemental, beginning in helping children make holistic categorizations based on musical mood or style. Training in analytical listening can actually hinder expressive listening and cause children to lose touch with their intuitive musical sense. That's an interesting piece of research to read. That's Bamberger from 1982. If this is the case, why don't we just teach expressive listening instead of trying to get students to recognize sonata form? The answer is that teaching analytical listening is far easier than teaching expressive listening. Analytical listening can be objectively tested and graded. Expressive listening, not so much. Let's talk about children and expressive listening. Yuslin and Lauka concluded, the ordinary music listener listens to music many times a day, often in mundane, everyday contexts where music listening is not the primary activity. This listener chooses to listen to music to a large extent because of the valued emotional experience that it offers. Music is used to change emotions or to evoke emotional memories. This is an entirely different kind of listening than we're thinking when we are thinking young audiences in a concert hall. We're presenting music for them that we're hoping is going to reach them emotionally, whereas they're used to making choices to control their own mood. Bain's research grouped subjects into 9 different listening styles, and it was found that the overwhelming majority of adolescents exhibited what Bain described as compensating listening, that is, listening to maintain or change mood. It helps us now that we're kind of into this expressive listening train of thought to acquire some tools to think about listening. And there are 2 basic models of listening that are simple models, but they're very effective, not just for thinking about listening, but for producers as far as working with concerts and musical experiences and crafting them to have maximal impact on young listeners. The first is a temporal model, and music is temporal, it exists in time, it's invisible. And listening is also temporal. The listener enters his listening with all of his previous experiences providing context for the listening, and this makes past experience and musical memory important. Then there's the listening, the moment of the listening, and it requires arousal. Something must get your attention, and something must keep your attention and focus your attention. It's not hard to get somebody's attention, but to keep it and focus it is a primary challenge. A little aside is Michael Posner's Trinity model of attention is a relatively easy way to begin understanding the mechanics of this phenomenon. And for a concert producer, I would really recommend looking into the Trinity model of attention, because there's some interesting things to think about there, especially when you're talking about the attention of young audiences. But then there's also the future part of the temporal model. In the immediate future lie the listener's expectations, and to the extent in which these expectations are fulfilled or denied, the listener will experience a strengthened or weakened sensation from his listening. The listening context and previous experience of the listener inform these future expectations. So it's kind of the preparation, the past experience informs the future expectations. And so there are a lot of different parts that have to be present in the model if it's going to be a strong listening experience. As a producer, the model that I have really gained the most working with concretely with my productions is amazingly pretty much echoed by the Orchestras way of the triangular reciprocal model that Orchestras has. It's the David Hargreaves reciprocal feedback model of listening. And it sounds really complicated, but it's the simplest model for listening that I've been able to find, and it's just brilliant. The model consists of 3 variables, and the component parts are the listener, the context, and the music. And those 3 things interact with each other to produce a response. The model establishes relationships that help us understand specific listening situations and analyze specific listening situations. And when a producer understands how these relationships function, he or she can define, refine, and adjust each element to create better conditions for listening. Let's spend a little bit more time on each one of these component parts. Let's begin with the listener. When we focus on a listener's role in the model, we're talking about individual difference variables like gender, age, nationality, ethnicity. The listener is also defined by musical knowledge, training, literacy, perception, and previous experience. And there's a bunch of applicable research that comes into this particular element of the listener. The first one is Seraphine's work. Seraphine describes listening in children up to about 11 years of age as single-track listening. The listener follows one aspect of music at the time. They either latch onto the bass line or the melody line or the beat. There's one element that they focus on. This has consequences for the complexity of the music that we will present to children in that age group, and underscores the importance of giving children something to listen for. Then there's also the perceptual part of it. People have a limited amount of visual and oral information that they can access and store in their short-term memory at any given time. As we get older and more experienced, we can group our visual and oral perceptions together in larger groupings in a process referred to as chaining or chunking. And although perceptual groupings can increase in size, they do not substantially increase in number. So throughout our lives, we have the ability to perceive 7 things, plus or minus 2, which is the magic number 7, plus or minus 2 is the George Miller's groundbreaking paper on field perception. And this is very true also in the concert hall. The consequences for children's listening is that only a limited number of impressions can be processed at any one time. And we can strengthen our concerts by reducing competing stimuli and increasing physical nearness to simplify the child's perceptual field. Then there's the mere exposure effect. And the mere exposure effect says that repeated listening to a music sample increases its preference. Now, of course, we can't like anything that we haven't heard before, but if we hear something 3 times, we start to like it a little bit more. We're more familiar with it. And that sounds logical. The interesting thing about the mere exposure effect is that after about 10 or 12 repetitions, we start to like it a little bit less. So there's a sweet spot for that type of preparation. But familiarity is the single most important predictor for liking music. And repeated listening increases the liking for music regardless of its complexity. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we're choosing repertoire. Abigail Howson's research is about aesthetic maturity, and she defines different stages of aesthetic maturity. And these different stages are able to access different aesthetic levels of an artwork. One of the most interesting points in her findings is that age does not necessarily translate to increased aesthetic maturity. It is possible for parents and children, or teachers and students for that matter, to be at the same level of aesthetic maturity. This has consequences for how we present our concerts and especially how we form our educational materials, because we can't depend on the adults in the room having more aesthetic maturity than some of the students, especially if they're students that are talented performers on instruments or things like that. This brings us to music preference, which is a strong factor in many concerts for young audiences. Sometimes around 11 or 12 years of age, liking specific songs or genres becomes more than a personal preference. It becomes a larger part of a growing sense of self. And this causes a divergence between music preferences, separating school music, as Dunn describes it, from life music. The deciding factor in this diversion appears to be choice. And at this point in the child's life, school music becomes increasingly more analytical, and the child's choice of life music becomes decidedly more expressive. Today, musical exploration is more individual, affordable, and accessible than ever before. With streaming, you can follow where your curiosity leads you. It's even cheaper to explore on free services like YouTube, where the algorithm feeds you something like what you just listened to so that you can go on and explore on the same path. Digital listener data from streaming services like Last.fm has shown listeners moving between related music genres over time, and their listening choices growing in breadth and complexity. By the age of about 16 or 17, most people have established music preferences that will follow them for the rest of their lives. The exception to this is children who actively perform music, and their musical preferences usually remain open longer, sometimes well into their 20s. One of the hallmarks of a good production for children is that it speaks to the world in which the child lives. Adult preferences often sneak into productions for children, weakening their relevance for the intended audience. If you're producing a concert for children and having a little bit too much fun, take a step back. Entrainment happens when an external stimulus creates sympathetic rhythmic movement. That means when we play something with a beat, we want to get up and dance. And we're the only beings that do that. Human beings are the only species, well, with the exceptions of a few species of parrot, actually. But by and large, human beings are the only people who move sympathetically to sound, especially rhythmic sound. And since entrainment is a sign that you are deeply into a listening experience, it means that demanding that children sit still at concerts can actually work against the child's listening and their aesthetic experience of the music. And we have to differentiate between this. Movement activities, while they can be very well planned and very well executed, getting the children all clapping on 2 and 4 during a concert is not entrainment. When the children start clapping on 2 and 4 without you leading them, that's entrainment. So we shouldn't we shouldn't mistake the symptoms for what's actually happening. We can synthesize the symptoms of entrainment by asking everybody to clap to the rhythm, but to making the preconditions for that it's going to happen spontaneously, that's a really wonderful thing. And then there's attention. A child's ability to attend over time increases with age. We have a peak in our attention. It ended about a minute and a half ago. And so usually when that happens, something new has to happen. And it's especially true in a concert for young people. Usually after about 20 minutes, you have to change up something. And any good classroom teacher will tell you that also. There are so many variables that come into play during thinking about attention that there's really no solid empirical research on it. But there is consensus about some things. And a good classroom teacher is probably a good touchstone to have. And also using children as a reference audience during production is a good touchstone to have about attention. After about 20 minutes, boy, you better have a white balloon in your pocket or you're in trouble. The next element is context. And context is really exciting because producers, per definition, create context. So each concert situation represents a unique context, and many of the elements that create the context are things that we can control or modify. Here we're talking about contextual elements like social context, cultural context, physical context, and perceptual contexts. So let's take social context first in regards to young audiences, because every concert has a social dynamic. Good communication can establish, as my colleague Jesper has demonstrated, good communication between the performers and the audience can develop a strong social contract. And if there's no connection with the stage, the audience is left to develop its own internal social dynamic, which means there's going to be a show, but not necessarily the show that you had planned. They will entertain themselves if they're not entertained from the stage. A child at a concert with his parents is a different type of listener than when he is at a concert with his classmates. And this is because his self-identity and social role is different in these two situations. Differing social contexts create different expectations or demands on the listener. But we can also create social contexts that strengthen our concerts. Many concert traditions have their own traditional codes, for example, not talking during the concert or refraining from clapping during a multi-movement work. And as I mentioned before today, if you know these codes, you feel a sense of belonging. And if you don't know these codes, you feel like you're on the outside, and who buys the ticket to be an outsider? Then there's a physical context. Where are you listening? There's a difference between a string quartet on stage at Wigmore Hall and the very same string quartet in a shopping mall. The difference lies in the perceptions of the listeners and the expectations they attach to a specific arena. There's a fabulous video on YouTube of Joshua Bell busking in a metro station in Washington, D.C. And the long version of it is like an hour and a half long or something. And all you hear is like just this wonderful, wonderful playing and thousands of people walking past without even turning their head. So it's the physical context has a lot to say. And proximity is a part of this. Proximity is an essential part of a concert's physical context. The music faces competition for the listener's attention, and proximity makes the music more important in the room. Many fine productions for children address the physical space between audience and performers through novel seating arrangements, untraditional performance arenas, or by setting limits on audience size. And once there is a physical context, we have to look at ownership. Who owns the context? I know an actress who performs a lot of theater in schools, and she always meets the students at the door, shakes their hand, smiles at them, says hi, asks what their name is, tells them what her name is, or the name of the character she's going to be playing. And I asked her why, because this is an exceptional effort. You know, there are lots of actors and actresses that in the last minutes before the performance are, deep in their role. And she said, I want them to be a visitor in my theater. I don't want to be a visitor in their gym. And that's a really, really interesting entrance into that kind of a performance. Then there's perceptual or sensory context. Some concerts present music together with movement activities or visual stimuli. And studies show that when these activities are carefully crafted, it is possible for children to link them to the music. However, more often than not, the children concentrate so hard on performing the movements correctly that it actually weakens their perception of the music. Something like this can also occur if children strongly associate with a visual stimuli during the concert. The music fades into the background. In these instances, elements that are meant to strengthen the concert can actually become competition with the music. The third component, the music. And here we need to talk about reference systems like genres and idioms, also correlative variables like complexity and familiarity. But basically it boils down to one thing, and that's programming, choosing program. And programming for young listeners is challenging. We don't want to present music that's beyond their reach, but we don't want to be patronizing either. A good concert must do more than follow their audience. The music must meet them and challenge them on an appropriate level. And that's the real hard work right there, going in, getting into that. Producing school concerts for the Trondheim Symphony Orchestra early in the 2000s, I met with the repertoire committee and asked them what they thought we should play. And they said rather decisively, we do the usual, the Britain, Peter and the Wolf, Star Wars, why make it difficult? And the orchestra's administration pointed out that they had to achieve a certain percentage of children and families in the reporting to the Department of Culture, so they were interested in filling up the hall. And they only had limited production time to devote to the concerts and limited resources. So we don't have the time or resources to do anything fancy. So I asked the musicians, well, if your own children were in the audience, and this was the only live orchestral concert they would ever hear, what would you play? And then that whole discussion changed radically and became very exciting, very inspiring. And they came to the realization that, it wasn't their kids, but a lot of the kids that were going to be in that hall, that might well be the only live orchestral concert that they were going to be hearing for their, entire life. And so they'd better make it count. So we ended up with a tremendous program for that concert, and one that the musicians really, really believed in. So there's a choice to be made. Are we going to be taking children on a return trip to something they know from before, or are we going to be taking them on a journey of discovery? Complexity is also a question when we're talking about programming music. Extremely simple music becomes uninteresting, and preference grows as examples become more complex. At a certain point, the music will become too complex, and the amount of preference will begin to decrease. So there's this curve from simple, so simple that we hate it, to more and more complex, and we like it more and more and more, and then we get to a sweet spot of complexity where it's just great, and then we kind of tip over the top, and it's like, oh, geez, what the hell is this? And, and it gets worse and worse and worse. That's called the Wundt curve, or the optimal arousal model. And the interesting thing is that the optimal arousal model and the mere exposure effect are theorized to work together. So as you listen to more complex music, after a while, your perception starts to organize it, and it becomes simpler in your perception. And that makes it become less interesting. And then you're looking for something that's a little bit more complex. So the whole complexity curve starts to move forward, and that's how listeners develop. All of this turns into a response, and I'll just say shortly about the response, that responses have been researched by any number of researchers. There's a lot of consensus on that there are 5 basic responses to the listening experience. There are extra musical responses. There are imaginative responses, cognitive responses, emotional responses, and physical or kinesthetic responses. The listener usually modulates through a variety of these responses as he or she experiences the music. The result is an inner mental representation of the music, embodied with meaning known only to the listener. This forms the basis for reflection, remembering, and differentiating listening experience. Now, there are some listening strategies to work with expressive listening. We don't have time to go into them today. They're kind of like a day-long seminar all by themselves, but there are techniques like Kate Hebner's adjective circles, Rob Dunn's mapping activities, Abigail Housen's visual thinking strategies. These are all just really simple and really powerful techniques for working with expressive listening, and especially with kids. And I've used them both with kids, which is great fun and really exciting. I've also used them with professional musicians who have kind of come into some sort of eureka state of mind because they're professional musicians, and of course they know how to listen. And when you start going into the nitty-gritty of it and they start to discover new things about listening, it's tremendously exciting. So it's well worth investigating those, and if some people want to know something more about them or some resources that they can look at, I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards. So that's all the theory. How does this help us in practice? I have 10 points that we should probably keep in mind bearing all this music listening theory in practice. One is proximity. That's why I asked you to move a little bit closer. Nobody ever wants to move all the way down. Everybody's willing to move one row ahead. Get them physically close to the experience so that the music can win out over other sound sources or distractions. Make the music the most important thing in the room. Number 2, make the audience feel welcome. For young audiences, a large concert hall is foreign and intimidating. Make them feel at home from the moment they enter the building. Number 3 is choice. Choice increases listener motivation and receptiveness. What about playing 3 short excerpts and letting the audience choose which piece they will hear all the way through? Number 4, program for attention. Design your concert to capture and hold the children's attention through musical means. Program carefully for single-track listeners. Keep in mind the complexity of the music in relation to the listening history and the attention span of the audience. Number 5, create context and references. Prepare the children for the music with the music. Number 6, teach listening. Use the Dunn, Hausen, or Hebner strategies to explore short musical examples. Give children a vocabulary to describe, share, and think about their musical experience. Number 7, build expectations. Consciously build listening expectation through devices like repetition, contrast, and a clear dramatic structure in your concert form. Number 8, yes, it's our fault. There are no bad audiences of children. There is, however, poor planning, repertoire choices that lack relevance, too much distance between the stage and the back of the hall, indifferent playing, poor communication, faulty logistics, and a slew of other areas where too little effort might be made. These choices result in unwanted behavior from the audience. But make no mistake, it's us. Number 9, have meaningful discussions after the concert. Don't just ask the children whether they liked the concert or if they had fun. These are loaded questions with a clear bias towards liking. And they also don't establish criteria for what liking is or what fun is. These are also closed-ended questions. They don't invite further discussion. They conclude. Instead, use open-ended questions that facilitate reflection and discussion. What did you hear? What was going on in the music? What makes you say that? How did the music make you feel? Why? Don't feel obligated to come to a conclusion. The point is to discuss in depth and explore. And number 10, trust the music. Thank you for listening.